Good morning. This is Dr. John Taylor Kent, and you're on the channel Awakening Israel. I haven't been populating this videos because I've been trying to bolster up the other channel, and I just wish I had started the one and worked on it to get enough views. I don't have that many views or many subscribers, but things are picking up, and I realize that I'm getting a lot of views on my short clips on this channel. I haven't checked on it in a while. I've gotten 2 strikes. I think they're on the other channel. I'm not sure. It's kind of odd. I guess I'm guilty of both of those. I failed to realize that you can't talk about certain subjects. They're verboten. It's forbidden to talk about the event in 2020 that basically changed the world. Okay. And it's forbidden to to speak against modern medical novel treatments, since they really are not tried and true and we're still sorting things out. It would seem that having free speech on those would be important. People want the electoral process to be supported, understood, that people will not rise up and, in violence against the government. And they are worried about that, since they did stage that insurrection and they tried to claim violence across the country on that. I think they're doing a good job keeping us entertained. I'd like you to like this video, share it, subscribe if you dare. I don't know how long I'm going to be on YouTube. I will go to Rumble most likely. I haven't investigated how to upload there. I've got plenty of videos. As a matter of fact, more than half of the videos that I've made for this channel, I found out this last week that they have not uploaded. So I don't know if it's a passive-aggressive censorship, perhaps, that maybe YouTube is against the Bible or against Christianity or against the truth that's in the Bible. I just don't know. I do tend to think of them as the enemy. I do tend to think of them as owning the world, part of the people that own and run the planet. And where do we get that from? We get that from the Bible. When Jesus, Yahshua, was tempted by Satan, there were 3 great temptations. And in one of those temptations, he took them high up on the mountain and showed him all of the domains, all of the governments, all of the countries, the peoples, showed him everything on the planet and said, all this will be yours. So he offered him the world. He said, hey, buddy, you can have this. All you have to do is worship me. Of course, Yahshua, Jesus, didn't take the bait, didn't go for it. And the rest is history, which is unfolding. You got to pay more attention to the Old Testament than the New Testament. 85% of what we call our current Bibles is in the Old Testament. Only 15% of it is dedicated space to the New Testament. However, our modern Bibles are lacking the Apocrypha, the 14 books. So you have to supplement that. You can't get that in my current Bible that I offer. I have asked for it. However, it will need to be a separate publication. And it's a tall order because it's much harder to sort out what should have been in there. I know for a fact that there are errors in the King James original Apocrypha, primarily because there's not even the same number of verses or chapters in the. Well, I think it's one chapter that's got like 70 or 110 more verses than in the New Revised Standard Modern English. It has less, actually. So the King James falls short. It doesn't give it. And the importance is that in those verses, it has the order for those who make it, who get to heaven, and the order for those who do not make it. And there are 7 points under each. And they're in proximate locations, so you can read those. And there's specific rewards. And those are important to me because my maternal grandfather visited me on the way out. He passed away, and probably within an hour he was at the foot of my bed, laughing his ass off at me, happy because he was going to go see his wife. He missed his wife. And he also was laughing because I was wrong. And he was right. And he was right. I was wrong. And I totally accepted it. I mean, I didn't think he should go to Alaska. I thought he would be a virtual pain in the ass, but it turned out that they had a wonderful time up there together in that last year of his life. And he had a good death. And he visited me on the way out. And nobody else has visited me on the way out. And I've lost most of my family. At least I don't remember anyone visiting me on the way out. But he passed away in his sleep, and I was in San Diego going to graduate school, and he shows up at the foot of my bed. And the next morning, my mother calls me. I think it was like 9 a.m. I had had breakfast. I think I was sitting down to read. Maybe I was still getting breakfast in the kitchen. Oh, I missed that apartment. Actually, it was quite nice. The weather was always perfect in Southern California and San Diego. I didn't get outside and enjoy it very much, and I think I might have gone to the beach once or twice, no more than 4 times certainly in the 5 years I was there. I did both a master's and a doctorate degree there. I got sick for 6 months, so it held me back some. It was hard to get internships as well, so it took me a little bit longer. Anyway, good things take time. And I was trying to get a dual major, which they wouldn't give anymore. The school was under fire, and they wouldn't award that. So I took everything except for the 2 advanced report writing classes. So I crossed in clinical psychology, general practice, with industrial organizational psychology. Anyway, enough about me on that. Let's go back to my grandfather visiting me. Because he visited me and he had the freedom to travel, that is the one tip that let me know my grandfather, that one grandfather, had made it. Now, the other grandfather might have visited me, I don't know, but I remember the one. And as I was saying, Mom calls, and she asked me to sit down. She had some news for me, and I was standing up at the time, and I said, Mom, are you sitting down? She says, no. I said, well, Mom, maybe you better sit down. And, I get too emotional, things like this, but oh well. Mom says, and I told my mom on the phone, she was sitting down, I says, I know. Mom, I know. She says, you know? I says, yeah. He was here. He visited me. And I proceeded to ask her questions because one thing I learned is that it's best to address the bull in the china closet than to ignore it. We Americans are guilty of ignoring the bull in the china closet a little too much. I'm sure you'll agree with me on that. And so I stepped her through it. We talked about his passing. She discovered him. He was blue, lack of oxygen. He was at peace. His jaw was slacked. And okay. He died in his sleep. He wasn't wired up. He died at home with family. Pretty cool. I mean, that's a lot better than being in the hospital dying with strangers like my father. He passed in the hospital, all wired up, kind of going in and out of present consciousness. And he said some funny things. I'm real grateful for the nurses for telling me about that. But back to Mom. So I asked her, what did you do the night before? What did you have for dinner? Why, we went to his favorite restaurant, this Chinese restaurant. And she told me about that, and I asked her, I asked her about, activities. I asked her about future plans. Well, they had future plans. He had talked my mom and my dad into going on a Caribbean cruise. They were going to go together as a family on the Caribbean cruise. I wish they could have made that. That sounds so wonderful. So he was making plans. I asked about his activities, and Mom told me, well, he was working your dad's ass off. Dad couldn't keep up with him. Here's this man that's in his 70s, and he was fixing everything in the house. If it wasn't done really well, he was redoing it. For instance, there were some drafty doors in the bedrooms, and he didn't like that, so the doors had to be rehung and resealed. And he was doing all that work. He did a lot. He was really skilled with tools in his hands. Anyway, he had a stroke earlier, about 10 years earlier, left hemispheric stroke. And as a result, he lost his speech centers. However, he could cuss clear as could be, but he had trouble otherwise with speech. And it was hard to understand him. And he repeated himself quite a bit, and I did my best to understand him. And some things just were out of my realm of understanding. Anyway, so there he was. He was busy, he was active, he was making plans. He ate his favorite food. Then I asked Mom the final question. Mom, when you had dinner, how was his speech? She says, why, it was clear as a bell. We understood every word he said. I said, yeah, Mom, he had a good death. He was making plans for the future. And he was there. And I also told her, that he was chiding me because I was wrong. And so Mom called to console me, and it kind of worked the other way. And it was bad news. It was not unexpected, but at least it was not at the end of a mysterious misery. At the end of an illness. It wasn't expected. It was rather sudden. He had smoked cigarettes and had emphysema. He liked his drink. He would always have, I think, a shot of whiskey after or at 5 o'clock. He worked in the mills in Newmarket, New Hampshire, in the shoe mills that were there, Red Wing shoes. He worked pretty hard in that and usually came home hands covered with glue. He was a good man, and he made it. He made it. Now, as I talk to you about him, I want to ask my mom questions about him and family, but I can't do that anymore. I miss them. Well, that's the way it's going to be. Mom did end at the end of a long illness. But what I was getting at is that those who make it get to travel. That's one of the rewards they get, is they get to go anywhere they want. And they get to see their reward, their ultimate reward. So they get to travel, go places, see people. And I take it that my grandfather got that reward. And he was visiting me. At the end of the week that they're granted to travel freely, then they're to take their place and rest. Okay. I know you're going to want to know what that means and how long one is at rest. Well, I don't know that. Read the Bible. It'll tell you. If that's what you want to know and you earnestly want to know it, you'll find it. You just got to read it. And when you find it, let the rest of us know. Please come back and put a comment down there as to what you found out. And if you've been visited by a loved one at the end, if you want to tell your story, fine. If you don't want to, that's fine too. Privacy is a good thing. There's not much of it anymore. So maybe it's best to keep that to yourself. I like the apocryphal books. They help to prove who the Israelites are, especially the book of Tobit. Also, there's no marriage license in the entire Bible, but there is a marriage contract in the book of Tobit, and that's the only example we have of a sheet of paper marriage license. This other stuff was an invention of the state. In case you're wondering, the government was wanting to raise money for World War II, so they created several licenses, and they told us they were just going to do that until the war was over. And of course, we still have marriage licenses where you pay the government, and now the government gets to screw with you in your marriage if there's a problem, and your children above all. God, I hate this government in many ways. I know it's useful, but they're becoming less useful and more useless. And now you have to have a fishing and hunting license. And I travel the states quite a bit, and I'd love to hunt. But why is it treated as strictly a recreational activity? Can I not catch a fish and cook it up to feed myself that day? Why am I barred from catching a fish or shooting a bird, and harvesting some food? Certainly when my forefathers came to this continent, not too long after 1649, by the way, we didn't have hunting licenses back then. And there was a lot of game, and we ate freely. Should we not have that benefit? I think we have got to have that just as much as we've got to have the Second Amendment. A man has to be able to defend his life. You have to be able to feed yourself. You have to be able to work. But 1/3 of you out there have to have a state license to work. They won't hire you without it. They won't hire me without it. And if the military wanted me to work as a psychologist for them, I'd do it in a heartbeat. But I'm not going to go underneath another state jurisdiction with these libtards running the thing, these jackasses. I'm not going to do it. I don't think I have the stamina for it anyway. I certainly don't have it in me to fight the board and defend my practice. And my practice was so far advanced of theirs that I didn't want to slow down, and I couldn't slow down and explain things to them. When things work, they work rather quickly. And, when you're sitting on your seat, the hot seat, and you've got to come up with things happen that I could not explain myself, and I went with the Spirit. Of course, I prayed most of the time before sessions. I don't know why. I guess I felt pretty hopeless. I guess I was fearful. I was worried. And I knew above all that there was more to a man, more to a woman than I could ever fathom. But I knew that it's not beyond Yahweh, Creator, Father, God's ability. So I would pray and appeal and say, Lord, what's the message you want me to deliver this person? What do they need right now? And then in the prisons, I was able to really hone my craft. Well, for one, you can get away with things in the prisons. I'm sorry to say that, but they got away with medical malpractice and killing inmates all the damn time. Nobody cares. But in my case, I could be very direct. And I was working most of the time in level 5 maximum security yards. And those guys get moved all the time. So typically, you're only going to see the guy once, maybe twice. And I actually had one or two guys in there and did what I call long-term therapy, about a year. I consider that long-term. If I can't fix it within eight sessions, I'm doing something wrong. There's something else going on here. I'm not getting it. Usually, because I only had one shot with these guys, I would wait and then I would give my impressions. And more often than not, I saw the jaws drop. And more than one time, I heard the inmate say, "You can see all that?" And usually my response was, "Yeah." And not only that, other people can too. And more times than I remember, I get a health needs request. The inmate wants to see me. And they're paying out of their own bank. I think the fee was $3 for the session for this to see me. And I guess I had a pretty good reputation because I did my job. The others would just bring the inmate in and say, I'm not going to charge you for this. And they wouldn't do any work. Well, me, I sat there and I did the work. And I did it the way the Arizona Department of Corrections wanted me to do it. I gave them a fully informed consent. And if they told me something that had to do with an unsolved capital crime or any diddling with the children, I reported it. Even the state agencies to which I reported got upset with me for reporting so much. Look, it's in your law. I have to report. I'm abiding by the law. Take the notes. And don't bother me, is what I told them, basically. They didn't want me bothering them. Well, the law had no relief. So I had no choice, even though it had already been adjudicated sometimes. I had to make the report. That's what the law says. That's what you do. Well, quite often the inmate would come back to see me, and I would open up the chart because I wouldn't remember them. I'd open up the chart. My handwritten notes were hard for me to read, but usually there were some key terms that would cue me up, and then I'd be flooded with the memory of them and what occurred, what happened. And I'd usually find myself looking down at the paper at my notes, looking up at them, down and up, going. And finally, I would look at the inmate and I would tell them, you're not supposed to be able to do this. Say, what? I tell them, you've changed. I've got my notes here. And they say that you're not supposed to be able to do this. You're not supposed to be able to overcome this personality disorder, for instance, this sort of thing. You're not supposed to be able to do this. But usually I provided the inmate with enough information and enough generic tips because it was hard to get specific with them. Sometimes I really could go deeply into things. But my generic advice was so wholesome, so good, that they took it. They took it to heart and did what I said. And some of these guys were really dangerous. And they knew they were dangerous, and they were afraid of themselves. And they were afraid they were going to hurt other people. And I figured out how to build in some impulse control in these guys. And I gave them my tips. I dug from everywhere. All of my training, every bit of it. And I worked with them so they could increase their ability to tolerate other people. I mean, some of these guys were marked. They were odd looking. They were a little bit kind of freaks of nature. Some had some really bad head injuries that stood right out. Some of them had, just incredibly wide shoulders and not much in the terms of hips or waist. They just were freakish looking. And that one guy I'm thinking of that I described like that had to turn sideways to get into the room. He was so big. To get through my office door, he had to turn sideways, and he wasn't that tall. But people always picked fights with him. And no wonder he grew up the way he was and explosive, because he had to defend himself so much, so often. So we worked on impulse control. And at the end of the year, he was able to tolerate me. We sat for 45 minutes or an hour. That's what I was working on, getting him able to tolerate more than 10 or 12 minutes. And at the end of it, I hadn't shared with him until the end. I said, I think you're ready. I think we've been successful here. You're able to tolerate me. You sat here for 45 minutes or an hour, and he panics because then he was like, oh, what? Yeah, you're okay. You're doing, Anyway, what I'm getting at is that I prayed before the sessions, and I got answers. And there were only a few that I couldn't sort out. And one time I had to pop my head around the corner to Padre. We had the chaplain. And I told him, I says, I think this guy's one of yours. And he was reading his Bible. He didn't even look up. He says, yeah, I know. I says, look, I can't do anything. I couldn't do anything for him. It was beyond my expertise. This was not a simple schizophrenia in this kid, this young boy. And he says, don't worry, we'll take care of it. And they took care of it, but I'm not going to detail that here because it's a bit of a confidence, and if they're still doing that kind of work in there, it's good work. I'd hate to see them shut down because they're doing the right thing. And it's not in the wrong place. But it could go against the state because the state is against religion. You know, the separation of church and state. Well, that was written up so we wouldn't have an official state religion. That's all they were against. The whole country was Christian oriented. Different flavors, different denominations, and different states. And they didn't want to argue about that. And so they did have that religious freedom at the federal level. And the states could do what they wanted. And every state had a test of faith in order to run for office. So in order to hold office, you had to be a member, basically, of the faith, of that church, of Christianity, a Christian somehow or other. Now, I'm not entirely against the Christian faith. I just think it's a bit misguided. I think we've been purposely misguided. I think the evil ones infiltrated the seminaries by 1850 and the Bible publishers, and they gave us distorted text, distorted versions. They gave us footnotes that had political agendas. The NIV Study Bible certainly has that. Anytime you see a term that modifies justice, like social justice, then you know you have a political agenda. Because justice is one of those terms that has to be unmodified. Because once you call it economic justice, there is no justice to it. Once you call it social justice, racial justice, whatever you put on it is not justice. Justice is a pure concept. The word has to stand by itself. And if it doesn't, you're catering to an agenda. Don't fall into that trap. However, the NIV Study Bible I have from 1983 was very good in one sense. It got across some orders from Yahweh that you don't pick up in the other versions. At least they're not as pronounced. And what I learned from reading this Bible 3 times was that there's a command, and that is to love truth and justice. So that's the command I want to give you. Love truth and justice. In that order. Why? Because you have to know the truth in order. You have to know the truth before you can have justice. And in case you're wondering, we are supposed to judge. Being a judge was a position of honor. It was a noble position. The judges were at the gates of the city, and they held court, and they made decisions. They helped people sort things out so they would understand things and behave better and do better. They were there for the benefit of everybody. It's not that way today. We have 2 different justice systems today, and it's not very good. We don't have a very good system when it comes to that. And that's partially because of the missing original 13th Amendment that held for the separation of powers. You see, that put the attorneys in their place. And it also got rid of the traitors from Britain, the Bar Association, the British Accreditation of Registry, those traitors that got us into the War of 1812. So, the separation of powers resulted in all Bar Association members not having citizenship. Took away all citizenship. Any and all citizenship is what it says. But it also barred them from holding public office in the other 2 branches of government. As officers of the courts, attorneys were already, as experts in law, were already officers of the courts. And so they're already part of the government. They're not permitted to be elected to the legislative branch or to the executive branches. Oh, certainly they could perhaps go up to the Supreme Court, but they could not be legislators. We need to go back to that. We need to go back to that as fast as we can. That's the number one thing that you can do, is restore that original 13th Amendment and make all subsequent amendments null and void. The 14th was out of order. Well, the 14th and 15th were ratified, if you will, while the South was occupied. And the Southern folks weren't free to vote for their congressmen. They weren't free to vote for their state legislators. And the state legislators chose two people from among themselves to represent their state governments and be their senators at the federal level. So the Senate and the Congress were appointed for them. They weren't represented. So those are null and void. And besides that, the 14th Amendment enslaved us all. How? Before the 14th Amendment, and even after that for quite a while, we were considered citizens of our states. So I was a citizen of New Hampshire, one of the original colonies. And it created a citizen of the United States to give the blacks citizenship. And it also it resulted in them being accounted as three-fifths of a man for the purposes of representation in Congress, because they didn't want the blacks overtaking the nation, and being represented equally. I censored myself on the word fairly, and I don't know why. In case you're wondering, Abraham Lincoln was going to deport all the blacks back to Africa with gold and silver. Abraham Lincoln said that the races were not compatible. And he died with that executive order on his desk, unsigned. He was going to sign it the next day. And so they were going to deport all the blacks back to Africa, and they actually started a couple of nations over there for the purposes of receiving them. Now, that's not all you don't know about Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was a very disturbed man. His life was kind of an odd one. His father was A.A. Springs of Alabama, and we know that because of A.A. Springs said so in his last will and testament, in which he left his property, his land, to his son Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was you want to call them races, I prefer species. He was a 3-in-1 hybrid, if you will. He was part black, part Native American, and part white. And I say that with emphasis because he was part Jewish or not Jewish, depending on how you look at it. He was the offspring from one of the Rothschilds. I think he was a grandson of a Rothschild. Okay? And I say white because the Khazars from which they came from were a Turkish-Mongoloid mix until the Edomites from Mount Seir migrated up to help their new brothers in the faith with their conversion to Judaism about approximately 700 AD. I know that's a lot right there. So I'm going to be populating this channel with more videos. I'm going to probably put up more short things and try to see if I can get a bit of viewership on that. I've gone long on this to make up for things. I don't know if religious freedom is allowed on YouTube. I mean, they may decide to quench this entire thing. I don't know if Christianity is allowed here. I think it is, but only in terms that you worship the Jews, that you make them your God, your golden calf, and you call them the chosen ones, the chosen people. That's not accurate. They gave that to us in the Schofield Reference Study Bible about 100 years ago. Moses was not a Jew. Abraham was not a Jew. There were no Jews until the Babylonian captivity, and you can find that fact up for yourself. Look it up yourself in the Jewish Encyclopedia, and they will tell you that the Jewish faith properly cannot be said to have come into existence until the Babylonian captivity. It came out of Babylon. Israelites went in, and we have something else that came out. It was different. And things got mixed up. The Maccabean revolt was much more serious than what we realized, because at the end of 5 years, the victor, John Hyrcanus, told the Edomites at Mount Seir that they could live provided they get circumcised and they convert and they worship the one true God. That's akin to the ultimatum that Shem gave his nephew, Canaan, that he had to stop doing the worship in the groves, the child sacrifice, the sexual practices, and he had to worship the one true God, or he was going to kill him. And ultimately, that's exactly what Shem did, is he killed his nephew because of the horrible things he was doing. At that time, he was doing those things publicly in the groves. And when they killed him, the word is, cut his body up and sent pieces of his body around to the tribes with a warning that this is what's going to happen to you if you're going to continue these evil practices in the groves, in the ashram, in which you're doing weird sexual practices and passing the children through fire. You're worshiping Molech and Baal. And that's where you get your secret societies from, because those people that did that stuff realized Shem's a pretty mighty warrior. He means what he says, and he's going to do it. So they took their practices underground, secret. So that's where that comes from. Well, I've covered quite a bit here. I don't know how much I'm referring to the Bible. There was another fellow that didn't refer very much to the Bible. It turned out he knew it really well. I didn't realize that until recently, and that was Wesley Swift. Wesley Swift was so brilliant and so sharp that the FBI showed up at his door on many occasions, demanding to know where he got his information, because he knew things like the number of nuclear bombs in the arsenals of the Soviet Union and the arsenal of the United States of America. He knew the numbers of missiles, the numbers of bombs, and all that stuff, and mentioned them in his sermons. Ultimately, the gentleman was murdered in about 1970 or 74, I think it was. He went to Mexico, and they got to him through food poisoning. So they murdered him. They killed him. They couldn't shut him up. The man spoke with pressured speech. It's like a damn machine gun going off. And it really rattled me a bit, and I think he had that effect on others. And he kept calling us to fight them, to fight the Russians, the Soviet Union, that we certainly could win the war and we could overcome this, and how evil they were. Well, I think he was missing some things. And by the way, at the end of his life, he paired up with Commander Lincoln Rockwell, who started the American Nazi Party. I think it was a horrible mistake and a horrible name. My God, why does anybody want to call themselves the N-word, the real N-word? Why do they want to prejudice people against them like that? The two of them joined forces, and the two of them were going to be way too dangerous, because Rockwell didn't understand the Bible, and he didn't understand how we got here, where we came from. Rockwell understood the present and what was going on in the here and now. And the two gentlemen together would have been a formidable pair. I mean, from them, we probably would have gotten decent presidents somehow, decent men who would have corrected this stuff. And I'm still trying to remember the name of the Democrat they murdered in Flight 007. He was brilliant. He was strong. And he understood what was going on. That's not true today for any of these leaders, except they're willing to go along with the evil ones that are running the country and the planet today. So, enjoy your God of War. It looks like that's what's going to be worshipped here pretty soon. It's going to be a lot more sacrifice made in this century. The last century, they only killed 100 million, maybe 200 million of us. And when I say of us, I'm talking about real Israelite descendants. So they killed, in my estimation at one point, I decided it was 200 million, but we know it was 100 million in the Soviet Union alone. So I think they killed 200 million of us in the last century, and they're fixing to kill more of us, and they may already have killed more of us in this century. We don't know. We can't tell. The news is totally controlled. I don't get good stats from anywhere. I can't even repeat the things that I've heard, least that offend my keepers here, which I think are beholding and part of the bad guys as well. We don't have the American way anymore. We are not for truth. You can't speak the truth here. And we certainly aren't for justice, and we're not going to get justice. And if you want to know what we're headed for, read the book of Zechariah. It describes the nuclear war. It describes the nuclear holocaust. And I believe that's the book that also describes the biological warfare. And then you can look at Revelations for more about that, and you can look to Isaiah for more about that stuff as well. They are describing a nuclear war. And so we're at the end of the earth age, and a lot of you want to hold to the promise that God says he won't destroy the earth by water again. Well, I'm not so sure about that promise, to be honest with you, because it seems like when we get recycled at the end of an earth age, there's a muddy flood of limestone that goes over the whole place, and sometimes it's really devastating and really bad, and that's when you get this basalt, this shale, this dark rock. So that happens about every fifth cycle, or after 5 cycles of the lightweight destruction, the lightweight rebirth of the earth. Folks, I do need you to like my channel. I need some comments. I do need some guidance. My biggest problem is when to keep my mouth shut and when not to say. And of course, my style, this free flow of consciousness, which is my style, doesn't seem to really fit here. So I will be uploading all of this stuff over to Rumble. It's going to take me quite a while to separate it out and sort it out, because I haven't got a standard format, and I haven't cataloged these things. I haven't given them numbers or anything like that, and I really should give them numbers and dates and better titles. But I'm just trying to give them catchy titles. And I think the most important thing is this: love, truth, and justice, and the American way. You know what show that was from. You've been listening to Doc Kent. Yahweh bless America.